We got Negroes here who were duped into a whole generation of stupid struggle. We have Jesse Jackson out here claiming to be speaking in terms of violence. We got an old leadership group of people here who are principally responsible for the violence that is occurring in the black community, pretending to be dealing with it. For it was their decisions made in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, and the 70s that created the kind of community that our youngsters must contend with today. Our youth did not make these neighborhoods. Our youth are not making the world that they live in, and yet we spend a great deal of time analyzing them and their music without analyzing ourselves as adults and looking at the decisions we made in the 60s and 70s that place our youth in the kind of situation they face today. And we cannot say that we were not warned. As a matter of fact, W.E.B. Du Bois warned the NAACP as far back as 1934 when he told them that blacks would be segregated for decade upon decade, and therefore the NAACP needs to promulgate an economic program for African people in terms of where they were in the American culture. And if African American people were segregated in the American culture, then African American people needed to develop an economic system based on their segregated reality. He was thrown out of the NAACP for that reason. And he told them then in 1934 that African people would be segregated for decade upon decade. Why not establish an educational program that spoke to the needs of the people where they were? He was seen as a latter-day Booker T. Washington for saying so, and was thrown out. Booker T. Washington himself, at the turn of the century, was warning of the same thing. You need to get economic power. You need to gain control of your internal markets. You need to establish your economic stability. Deal with the votes later. This is what other immigrant groups do. No, the NAACP struggled, called him an Uncle Tom, derided this man, and now what do we have? We have the right to vote while we are homeless. We have the right to vote while we are jobless. We have the right to vote while our children are miseducated. This right that we were told would bring us a cornucopia of blessings and freedoms. We have the right to ride the front of the bus, and we're the only one riding on it. Yes. We have a right to sit at the lunch counter with white folk and we ain't got no money to buy a sandwich. We got all of these abstract rights, but nothing real. And this is the situation we face. We inhabit neighborhoods where the industries have flown away and left us bereft of jobs and opportunity. Why? Because we have not paid attention to the realities of our lives. And now we are overrun with violence, because violence is the result of social disorganization. Violence is the result of a nation not being able to feed and clothe its people legitimately. I think Ellis was the one, and his group indicated that when you looked at the number of black inmates in the prisons of New York, you would see that 75% of them came from essentially 7 neighborhoods in the whole state. And when you look at those neighborhoods of Brownsville and Harlem and South Jamaica, South Bronx, these areas, you will see that those are areas that have high indicators of other social problems. Joblessness, unemployment as we call it, low levels of education, high levels of infant mortality, a low percentage of native people in those areas that own and control the internal markets. In other words, there's a very direct relationship between the economic organization, between the educational organization and institutional organization of those communities and the violence that is a part of those communities and characterize those communities. A very direct relationship. And yet when they were told in the 50s and the 60s that the economies of these communities should fall into the hands of African people and be developed by African people, they were told that we were engaged in self-segregation, that we would all live in suburbs with white folks. We'd all be a part of the Fortune 500. Our children would all be bused to learn that 2 plus 2 is 4 in Scarsdale and White Plains, as if 2 plus 2 is not 4 in Harlem. And yet we find ourselves overrun with violence here today. In other words, then, what we have recognized is that the major struggle in America is not the struggle for political democracy, but for economic democracy. For you can have political democracy. You can vote if you want to, but you can still be poverty-stricken. You can vote if you want to, but you will still have no power. As Robert Allen in his book, when he talks about, the Black Awakening in Capitalist America, he makes this statement that too many of us still believe that democracy works the way it is described in school textbooks. That is, that political power is based on the will of a majority of the people in a given geographical area. He goes on to say, but political power in America is dependent on those who control valued resources and critical institutions, not vice versa. And those who have this power cannot be voted out of their positions by the public at large, because the base of their power lies outside of the formal political sphere. Their base of power lies in the corporations and the large public institutions, which are interdependent but largely removed from the sway of public pressure. What did I just get through saying? The people that will run the global economic system and control the politics of America are not people who run for office. The heads of multinational corporate systems don't run for office. You don't vote on their election to their offices. Yet it is those very people who determine the political and economic destiny of people. And yet you got a group of people, even on the radio station you revere so much, that tell you voting is your key to power. Voting is not a key to power. And we got a joker in South Africa who's running the same game on the South African people, who's going to run a game on African-American people, claiming that they got a multi-ethnic, multicultural society, who are going to probably mix their diplomatic missions with blacks and coloreds and Afrikaner whites so that they can impress on the world that they have achieved diversity in the world. When the ownership of the production and the ownership of land and wealth will remain as much in the hands of whites as it has ever remained. And you will think because you have elected a Nelson Mandela to be the president that you represent the taking over of South Africa by black people. If you believe that, you believe in the tooth fairy. You have never seen any multicultural, multi-ethnic nation rise to the top in the struggles of the world. You've only seen ethnic nations and nations based on ethnicity. But you want to fall asleep to some swan song. And Nelson Mandela should know better. He has the whole history of Africa before him, when other African jokers told their people that if they controlled the legislatures of their nations, and if they elected the heads of their government, that meant that they were free and in control of their nations. And yet today, as I told you earlier, Africa is frozen out of economic development with its African heads of nations and its African legislatures. Why? Because they did not see the first things first. And the first thing in a revolutionary change is that the revolutionary people take control of their lands and their wealth, or otherwise they have no real power. And power in America is not the power of the vote, but the power of the ownership of resources and the ownership of labor and control of labor. For when you own these things, you can buy the votes, and you can buy the elected officials voted into office by the people. You want a true example? If you read a few months ago, you would have seen your great Major Owens and your great Jenkins from New Jersey and some other black politicians of the Black Caucus being wined and dined in South Korea, having to meet the presidents of South Korea, meeting the president of the largest corporations over there, attending seminars on race harmony. What's going on here, ladies and gentlemen? These people whose trips were sponsored by a Korean pastor who pastors a black congregation in Nyack, New York, sponsored by the Koreans in America. What do you think is going on? You think because you voted for these people, they are going to see about your interests when another people is whining and dining them and toasting them and contributing to their campaigns and so forth? If you do, you're out of your mind. But this is the way politics is played, not by voting. You're deceived by a bourgeois class that is wedded to the Democratic Party, that has got the few crumbs that it has from being attached to the Democratic Party. That's why it cannot create an independent black party. You got the owners of your radio stations and other stations preaching to you about voting day in and day out. Why? Because they gained their privileges because they were voted into office by black people and used their being voted into office to parlay into the ownership of a bit of property. And therefore they want black people in America to believe that electing them to office represents the path of freedom for the masses of the people. And consequently, then, they educate you about voting, but do not educate you about the reality of power in America. They make you think, then, that their power represents the power of the people. These lessons are too clear. But people who don't read, people who do not know the power of the word, will have all of this information right in front of them and perish.